Yes, sir.
Okay, so I first of all wish to thank Professor Wu for the opportunity to give this talk, and my best wishes also to Professor Zhang for his speedy recovery. The qualitative properties of information suffer from being viewed as imprecise, inconsistent, subjective, value-laden, and context-dependent, rendering rigorous discussion and progress difficult. Semantic and algorithmic approaches to the quantitative aspects of information are mathematically tractable, while the qualitative cannot be subsumed under the standard logical criteria of bi- or multivalent truth functionality. My logic and reality can improve this situation by addressing issues of qualitative information, giving them proper ontological value, and placing them in the proper relation to epistemology. As some of you know, I have proposed an entirely different non-semantic, non-propositional, and non-truth functional logic as the logic of real processes and systems, according to which they interact and evolve. My non-linguistic logic of processes is based on the pioneering work of the Franco-Romanian Stefan Lupasco. The fundamental principle of this logic in reality is that the contradictory or opposing elements of complex real processes move from states that are primarily potential to ones that are primarily actual, and vice versa, alternately and reciprocally, without either going to the limits of 0 or 1. LIR and this principle of dynamic opposition constitute the framework for my logical philosophical analysis of all complex phenomena, including that of information. Logic in reality addresses issues of qualitative information, giving them proper ontological value and placing them in the proper relation to epistemology. And I should say that I would consider my logic in reality as a candidate for the 4 references to logic use that we heard in Wolfgang's talk just previously. The standard definitions of ontology and epistemology are the studies of respectively the real, what is or exists, what we can know, and 2, how we know and validate that what we know is correct. If so, does information belong more in the domain of science or philosophy, the abstract or the concrete? Is it primarily ontic, part of the real world, or epistemic, part of knowledge? While this question may not be significant in all areas of information research, it may be relevant for anything that involves the value of such research for the common good of the society, including the establishment of a global sustainable information society. I suggest that it is necessary to identify what parts of contemporary information science and information philosophy are relevant to that objective. The problem is that because only epistemology includes subjective aspects of knowledge, the latter are considered as having less scientific value than their apparent objective computable counterparts. This is the aporia I am trying to resolve. Everyone has his or her own ideas and definitions about what information is, what kinds of information exist, and what are their properties. Included are our ideas about the relation of information to data, knowledge, and meaning. Most of the time, we do not relate our respective concepts of information to ontology and epistemology, but I believe we should. Some standard definitions of information and those of Professor Wu Kun are summarized in this chart. My preferred description is shown on this chart, is that information is constituted by bundles or sheaves of elements of real cognitive processes changing and evolving together. Information processes are thus linear and nonlinear, consistent and inconsistent, epistemic and ontic, meaningless and meaningful, non-interacting and interacting. The first members of each pair follow standard logic, the second my dynamic logic and reality. And the best model of which I am aware is the complex systems model of Gianfranco Minati, in which all types of processes coexist. I emphasize that information cannot be or should not be discussed in terms of static objects or concepts, but as processes. As Ladyman and Ross state in their key book of 2007, everything must go. Information for me is a natural process, evolving according to the general principle of dynamic opposition in my logic and reality in all natural processes. The concept of information as process is consistent with an overlap between physical ontic and non-physical epistemic aspects of information. The overemphasis on the epistemic properties of information is for me an error in the theory of knowledge. Based on the contradictorial principles of LIR, what information is in reality and what constitutes a proper theory of information, of which information is the substrate, cannot be totally separated. Further, the real properties of informational entities or processes, binary and non-binary, are not independent of and cannot be discussed without reference to the a priori non-binary energetic processes that are their source in some real situation at all levels of reality. The LIR approach thus incorporates and provides for a relation between two complementary components of information. Information as well-formed, meaningful, and truthful data, in the definition of Luciano Floridi, and information as real energetic processes, whereby information as processes can function as higher level operators on information as data at a lower level of reality. To focus the discussion, let me ask the following. Suppose we take as the definition of information Floridi's well-formed, meaningful data. I submit that this is a definition that is purely epistemological. The epistemic cut made here is between information and the reality of the processes underlying the data. The scientific philosophical concept that I want to analyze in informational terms is this onto-epistemic cut, which reflects the general view that ontological and epistemological perspectives are disjunct. The subjective first-person content of epistemology is opposed to the alleged objectivity of ontology. However, ontology is frequently, not to say generally, limited to a system of classification or categorization of the concrete furniture of the world without expressing the features of interaction and change. One example is the epistemic cut in biology, formulated by Howard Paty to take account of the matter-symbol distinction. I showed in 2008 that the illusion of isolation of symbols from matter arises from the arbitrariness of the apparent epistemic cut. The apparent isolation of symbolic expression from physics seems born of an epistemic necessity, but ontologically it is still an illusion. Making a clear and necessary distinction is not the same as isolation from all relations. One clearly separates the genotype from the phenotype, but one certainly does not think of them as isolated or independent of one another. If the illusion of isolation is an epistemic illusion, whose reality is accepted, symbolic expression is not metaphysically isolated from physics. Consequently, their relation or interaction is real. The remaining question concerns the use of antagonism or constraints to best characterize its dynamics. This can be resolved by a view of symbolic memory constraints as dynamic processes in themselves, co-evolving with the other components of biological systems. Wu Kun in China has pioneered in the field of the philosophy of information, his Western counterpart being Luciano Floridi in Italy. My recent article with Wu Kun on the convergence of science and philosophy under the influence of information and its rapid development suggested a similar convergence of ontology and epistemology. One can restate the Ontic epistemic distinction, in informational terms, reflecting the underlying principle of dynamic opposition in nature as formulated in logic and reality. My synthesis incorporates Terence Deacon's ideas about information as absence, close to Roberto Poli's ideas about the ontology of what is not, or not fully, there. I thus agree with Ladyman and Ross that one need not worry about the apparent insubstantial nature of information because there is no absolute dichotomy between the abstract and the concrete, or between the substantial and the structural in the first place. Excuse me. One does not need and should not say that the world is, quotes, made of information, which is bad old dualistic ontology, but that information is a fundamental concept for understanding the objective modality of the world, its laws, cause and effect, and kinds. Citing Zeilinger, Ladyman and Ross repeat that it is impossible to distinguish operationally in any way reality and information. The notion of the two being distinct should be abandoned. My logic and dialectics enable this statement to be rationally applied, that is, to cases and situations whose complexity requires it. Attempts to counter it by reference to limiting idealized cases should be rejected, here as elsewhere. Examples are simple binary events at one end of the spectrum and constructed catastrophic counterfactual examples with zero probability of actualization at the other. It is part of reality that two human beings are physically and immunologically separate, but their minds are or can be in a joint state of communicational overlap. The tension in a view of information that goes beyond a purely epistemic scenario is visible in an article by Harold Atmansbacher of about 20 years ago. If in the terminology information is replaced by entropy, Weizsäcker's familiar terminology refers to potential information. If the referent of this term becomes actual information, if and only if it becomes epistemic. I welcome Atmansbacher's description of the process as an interplay between the two concepts, since I consider all such interactions as instantiating logic and reality. But Atmanspacher then says that there is no way of gathering or using information about a reality referred to by an ontic description, since it is exactly the act of information gathering that leads to an epistemic concept of realism differing from its ontic counterpart. Atmanspacher's weak intuition is that insight into an ontic reality might be inferable in an indirect manner, but the framework of an ontic epistemic distinction might be suitable for such an endophysics. I believe that logic and reality is exactly such an endophysics, amplifying and I think to a certain extent improving the 1996 definition by Otto Rössler, which we don't have time to go into here. The point is that the ontic and epistemic, the distinction of ontic and epistemic levels of description is not and does not need to be strict. When a human being is the egos, the information gathering and using system, ontic and epistemic perspectives are not confused or conflated. They are related dialectically and physically by the principle of dynamic opposition. In conclusion, a discussion of information in terms of ontology and epistemology requires, first of all, a concept of ontology as a description of the real dynamic, physical, and mental processes of the world, and second, their interaction with epistemology and its focus on knowledge as such. All these processes are informational. The convergence of ontology and epistemology is similar to Wolfgang Hofkirchner's concept of apraxio-onto epistemology. The areas of information science and philosophy, as in others, could benefit from the application of this general concept of the non-separability of ontic and epistemic domains. That told me I had 1 minute left, and I'll finish in time. Information thus expresses non-separability as a fundamental scientific philosophical, as well as logical principle. I see two directions for the applicability of this principle applied to the ontic epistemic distinction. A new synthetic natural philosophy in its relation to science, the conceptual structure and role of information of a potential sustainable information society. The second will be the subject of a forthcoming webinar of the Institute for a Global Sustainable Information Society. Thank you very much.